So I make that 12:30. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Johnson from Primary Care Direct, and we're here today in collaboration with Lincolnshire LMC to talk about primary care networks and next steps. A little bit about Primary Care Direct. We were born about 4 or 5 years ago with 4 founder members, all of whom will be speaking today from Agencia, BHP Chartered Accountants, Capsticks Solicitors and DKJ Support Services. The objective of Primary Care Direct is to be a one-stop shop for all things primary care, so hopefully a single point of contact for all your support needs. We're a consortium model, and some of our members, their logos are on screen now, and some of our main hitters are Capsticks Solicitors and BHP, Neha from Capsticks, Jenny from BHP, and they're going to be talking to you today. On the screen is an agenda for what we're going to be addressing, and I think we'll go straight into it. And I will just draw your attention one more time to the Q&A facility. If you hover over the screen, you can ask questions through that, and we'll address those in the time scheduled towards the end of the webinar. I do have connectivity issues, so again, thank you panelists for helping me out in that respect, if anything comes through. So I'll hand you over to Kieran Johnson, and Kieran's going to talk about, I'll give you a quick health check. Kieran?
Thank you, Damien. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having us here to talk to your PCNs in Lincolnshire. The aim of today is to kind of look at PCN progress, and one of the first things that we always do with all the PCNs that we work with, and we are currently working with over 75 PCNs nationally, is to actually undertake a health check with them to see actually where are they, and what areas of progress have they made, and also what are the things that they need to be doing in order to achieve their kind of ambitions by 2024. So as we know, PCNs have been running for the last probably coming up to 2 years now, and as I mentioned, it's always a good time now to do a stock check of where you are as a PCN. So I'm just going to run through just some of the things that you may want to think about, and some of the kind of work we've been doing with PCNs, which may help you think about some of the things that you might want to do to progress your PCN as well. So to start off with engagement, think to yourself, how engaged are the practices within the PCN? We know that from the work that we've been doing with all these different primary care networks nationally, that sometimes that in a board meeting or any other meeting where decisions are to be made, that practices can often say the right things, but actually behind closed doors, they may actually be saying something differently. So, one of the things that we do when we're working with PCNs is we actually sit down individually with each of the practices within those PCNs and ask them, what is it that you think about the PCN? What do you think about where the direction of travel and where you expect to be by March 2024? And also some of the more finer things like looking at, well, how is the workforce, the R's workforce working for you? What is the vision? Like, what is it that you would like to achieve as a practice within this PCN? And also, how does this help your patient population as well? So have a think about the engagement and how engaged, or maybe is there a lack of engagement with practices within your primary care network, and how is that helping making your PCN succeed? Similarly, around vision, what is your vision for your primary care network? So did you set a vision in 2019, and does that vision actually ring true now? Is it actually relevant? And also, do you need to change that for what you want to achieve by 2024 at the end of this current contract? So it's having to think about, what does that mean? Is it relevant now? And also, do all of the people within the practices that you work within, and also within the PCN, so some of the R's workforce, do they actually know what the vision is as well? And has that been communicated well? So have a think around that. Similarly with the R's roles, where are you with this? We, as I mentioned, we work with so many different PCNs, and there's a range of employment models, and which I'm sure Neha and Jenny will speak about, but there's also across the board, there's different members of staff that have been employed. We work with some PCNs who haven't actually employed any members of staff, whereas we work with others who have got a full workforce, ranging from all the different roles that are available with the R's funding. And then also we work with some which are in the middle. So it's kind of thinking about, well, actually, is your workforce and is your hours funding, have you utilised that enough? How does this fit within the DES priorities and the service specifications that you have to meet? Do you want to base your workforce around any local priorities that you're thinking about? Or in some cases, we've had it where some PCNs have actually just looked at the amount of funding that's available to them and created a shopping list, and then have actually just built a workforce around that. So they're unsure about actually what is the work that they're trying to deliver. Some other questions that we get asked when we're working with these PCNs, but also when we're trying to support them, is who manages them. Yes, there is an element of clinical supervision that is required, but also who line manages them on a day-to-day basis. And is this actually consistent across the board, in the sense that actually is it one practice that line manages them, and do their terms and conditions and their benefits, is that the same as the other practices across the PCN? Also, where do they sit? We've had a lot of occasions where ours workforce have come in and they've actually not got a physical location where they can sit. So actually, how does that make them feel about belonging to the PCN? And we've had in some cases where staff members have left because, one, they don't physically feel like they are part of any sort of team, but also there's not been any work for them to do because that hasn't actually been identified as well. And also have a think about your future intentions as well. As you know, that your hours funding is going to increase from next week, and then the year on and year on after that. So have a think about, well, actually, what is it that you're trying to achieve? And this links in with your vision, is actually what you're trying to achieve, and how does your workforce fit in with that? And then Helen will talk a lot more about this a bit later on in the webinar. And also, have a think about some of those new roles that are coming on stream as well. You know that you will be getting a mental health practitioner from next Thursday, which will be 50% funded by yourselves, but also 50% funded by your local mental health community trust provider. So actually, what is that role going to do? That they need to be 100% fully embedded within the PCN. So do you have an idea about actually what they're going to do around that as well? So have a think about some of your future intentions about what your workforce looks like. With the DES, as year end approaches, what position do you look like? What have you been doing to meet some of these requirements? And also, how have you been monitoring progress in the middle of the pandemic and the absolutely amazing COVID response that PCNs have responded to the pandemic? So have a think about that, and have a think about also, how prepared are you for the future DES specs that will be coming on stream? Thankfully, not from the 1st of April, but will be coming at some point on stream throughout the year as well. And also, there should be a social prescribing service set up. Is it running? Is it being utilised? How many appointments a week does it provide? And what are the outcomes? This is something that is a contractual requirement, so it's something to think about as well. And another area of the contract is the IIF funding. So on average, a PCN can earn up to about £21,000. Have you been keeping an eye on these at all? Have some of the indicators, have you looked at those? I know with some of the PCNs that we're working with, there's the Ardens template, which they've been looking at, which provides data for each practice, so they can collate it by practice within the PCNs. But is there other ways that you've been collating the data and discussing this and getting them signed off by the year end? Also, have a think about the funding that will be available should you meet these indicators. As far as we know, that the funding isn't ring fenced. So what would you like to do with that? We know that some areas are looking at local projects, so to support their patient population. So some of the PCNs that we've been working with are like looking at setting up mental health cafes or frailty services, and hopefully being able to utilise some of this funding to support that. So have a think about what you could maybe use that funding for as well. I speak a bit about local relationships. How are relationships with your local partners? And that could be absolutely anybody within the health and social care sector, and also outside of that. How are your relationships with PCNs, other PCNs within the patch as well? We know that PCNs are the cornerstones for integrated care systems. So how involved are you in any of those discussions? Who is representing general practice from from within your geographical area. We know that in some areas that there is a primary care voice at place and ICS level, but primary care in that definition actually includes dentists, opticians, and community pharmacy and general practice, which has been represented by one person. So actually, how is general practice being heard at those levels? So are you aware of what's happening within your local area, and is it worth finding out a bit more to make sure that actually general practice isn't ignored in any of these key decisions that are potentially being made at place and at integrated care system levels? And I've put on there about COVID response as well. And, you know, there's not been many good things about COVID, but actually I think one of the things that we found is there's been a lot of, they've been thrown together, PCNs and practices within PCNs have been thrown together to work together in response to the pandemic. So, you know, capturing some of those elements of working together may be useful about thinking about progress of your primary care network. So as a takeaway of my kind of whistle-stop tour about health checks, and like I said, this is what we do day in, day out with primary care networks as we try and steady the foundations, is, you know, we know that PCNs were developed quickly in July 2019, with in some cases with some shaky foundations if they were put together very quickly. But as PCNs grow and as the funding grows, as your workforce grows, the foundations do need to be stronger. So there's probably no better time than in the next couple of months to actually undergo a PCN health check and actually have a stock check on actually what, you know, where you are with progress and actually where do you want to be by March 2024. So I'm going to move us on to, I believe it's Neha Shah from Capsticks, who's going to talk about the legal implications, but I will be available for questions as well. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Neha Shah. I'm a partner at Capsticks Solicitors. We're a national firm specialising in healthcare, and I specialise in particular in primary care. So a lot of my work involves GPs and in particular PCNs as well. That's just a little bit about us there. I understand that you're all at sort of different stages in your PCN life, and you know, there's different considerations for a lot of you. So I've split this talk into two, where I'll be looking at sort of the initial structures that were considered, especially when PCNs were formed, and then looking at a corporate structure and spending a bit of time on looking at corporate structures, which is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, and there have been some significant changes which have meant that we are getting more and more inquiries about corporate structures, but being mindful obviously that some of you might not be ready or in that position at the moment, and just looking at some of the things that you need to think about for your PCN. So just looking at sort of initial structures and considerations, but before that, if we go on to the next slide, we'll just have a quick look at what PCNs are. I appreciate you've been in a PCN for a while now, but it's just always a good idea to sort of recap as to what it is. So networks of GP practices based on 30 to 50,000 patient lists. We've been told generally that it's a hard bottom and a soft top, so you can go over that, but you shouldn't really go under that. We've seen a few PCNs that are now 25 to 30,000, and so, you know, it's not a hard and fast rule. It just depends on where you are in the country and what your circumstances are. It is for practices to work collaboratively. So we do know some CCGs or some areas in particular don't just want it to be one practice. If they've got lots of sites, they do want other practices working with them. And it's to do a number of things. Initially, it was just the 1920 was just to start working together, talking to each other. And I think that's what a lot of things happened. It was getting to know each other. It was sort of building the foundations. Not many employees under the additional roles really looking at the clinical pharmacist and the social worker. So sort of baby steps towards getting to scalability and to working collaboratively, and then moving on to the next steps, which would be working with others within the health economy and the health sector. We know that 2021 DES introduced a few changes to what was initially envisaged as a significant number of additional employees that could be employed, and 100% reimbursement of the ARRS scheme as well. what we started hearing from practices around that time is, whereas before they may not have had the appetite to employ the kind of numbers that the NHS England certainly hoped for in order to achieve a real multidisciplinary team at each practice, was that was certainly the case now, especially given the funding and especially given the additional roles. We've had some PCNs who have said, you know, that their staff numbers in terms of the additional roles have gone up from, you know, 5 to 20, and some even saying that they're in 3 figures. So certainly there is a lot of activity around where PCNs are employing, and in some cases where they're not quite sure yet as to liabilities and how to go about doing it, the different structures available to them, and so they've sort of held back on that. So really it was initial services, the extended hours, so again baby steps towards working together more. And as we know, in 2021 there were quite a number of additional services, some of which were fine. I think the care homes one probably was the most difficult to sort out, just because of the ways that they were originally divided up between practices. But I think a lot of learning for practices over the last 18 months or so in moving ahead with their primary care network. And certainly that's the question we now get asked a lot. Do you see this as the future? Do you see this as the voice of general practice? And I think certainly that's the direction of travel, that primary care networks are probably here to stay. So we look at the next slide. These are just some of the models of that your primary care network can take. So if you're not looking at the corporate model, which as I said I'll come on to in a moment, these are the models that you probably have. There are hybrids of this model around, of these models around, so just bear that in mind as well. This is the most common one, the lead practice model, and it is where one of the practices is the nominated pay, so that's where the DES funding comes in. And they are also the employer of all of the additional staff. They then have arrangements in place with the other practices in their network to share those employees. And so either there is some sort of shared employment contract or arrangement, or you set it out in your network agreement as to how you're going to do that. Jenny from BHP will look at this model a little bit more, and also talk about some of the issues that certainly financially may be faced with this particular model as well. As the lead practice and the employer, the liability for employment sits with the lead practice, and what you would be looking to do with your arrangements with the other practices is look to share that responsibility. And what we have heard, certainly as I said over the last few months, is that was fine when it was 1, 2, 3 employees, but certainly when you're looking at ramping up the kind of numbers that they're talking about, the lead practices are sort of putting their hand up and saying, actually, we're not quite comfortable with this. It's not just a financial thing, but we need to think about HR, payroll, all of the other things. Suddenly we have a large number of employees. So that's one of the other factors to take into consideration with when considering this model. But it is the default model. As I said, there's hybrids of this where other practices have also agreed to be the lead practice, so you almost have rotations of employment. But as far as I know, that's caused considerable headache as well, because all the networks employees are on different terms and conditions and things like that. So it's just something to be mindful of. The next model shows you the flat practice model. This was probably the most favoured model early on. However, the pensions agency made it clear that this model was, you were ineligible to access the pension scheme. So I think it's really fallen out of favour. But it was where, again, you had one practice that was the nominated payee, but in terms of the workforce, the employment contract was shared across all of the practices. So practice 1, 2, 3, and 4 would be the employer in a joint contract with the employee. It does cause a number of problems, and it was really suitable for smaller PCN sizes. So if you had 3, maybe 4 practices in a PCN, then it was fine. However, since PCNs happened and the Pensions Agency mentioned that this actually would not enable the workforce to access the pension scheme, as I said, I don't really think it's used as much anymore. The next model shows if you had a federation, and that was usually a federation, but if you had a federation or some other entity in your area and they were willing to support PCNs, then this would be the one to go for. So it was arm's length. You still a practice within the PCN was still the nominated payee if the company or corporate entity couldn't be the nominated payee because it didn't have the relevant contract. But the employment sat with the corporate entity, so your federation, for example, and then there were arrangements in place with the other practices in the PCN or a number of PCNs. As I know, federations did sort of serve multiple PCNs within their area and still do, to provide employment support. So the federation would do the employing, it would do the recruitment, it would be responsible for HR, etc., and it would then have arrangements in place with the practices and the PCNs to use the employees. This was the one that a lot of PCNs who had very good relationships with their federations used, because they could come to arrangements that were suitable for them and keep the employment at an arm's length and away from the practices. So yes, certainly if federations are in the area and they are looking to support their PCNs, which we know a number do, then this was a good model to use. So moving on, the network agreement. Now, up and down the country, we know that, and as Kieran talked about, the network agreement, it's always good to do a housekeeping check on your network agreement to make sure it's in the form that you want it to be in. It still reflects the type of decisions that you have been making. It reflects how you are arranging yourself. I mean, it was almost easy to create one in 2019 when you really hadn't gone down that process, but you'll have a much better idea now of how you have been operating as a PCN. And so it's a good idea maybe just to dust it off and have a look and make sure it is as you need it to be. It came in 2 parts. There was the mandatory bit of it, which couldn't be amended, but it was really the skeleton of what the agreement should look like, and a lot of it deferred to the schedules which needed to be completed by the PCN themselves. And there were 7 schedules which set out a number of different things that needed to be covered, and you would have to complete them yourself. So Schedule 1 dealt with really how the makeup of the PCN and how you had come to be where you were, and a brief description of how you were going to be doing things. Schedule 2 had the meat in it. It was really how you made decisions, how your board was going to be set up if you were going to have one, how you could leave, how you would deal with conflicts of interest. So quite a lot of important decision making set out in Schedule 2. So that's the one really to focus on when you're looking at this. Schedule 3 was almost sort of how are we going to deliver the services, and that could be updated on a regular basis as you took on new services. So almost a table there that you could complete depending on how you were going to be providing the services. Early on, it was a lot easier with the extended hours. You just had to really put down the number of hours that you were planning on delivering. Schedule 4 dealt with the finances. So you had the money coming into the nominated payee. How and when was it going to be distributed out? Who had authorization? Those sorts of things would need to be thought about in Schedule 4. Would you have an annual reconciliation? Are you planning on leaving some money in the pot? And those things should really be catered for in your network agreement. And then Schedule 5 was the employment schedule. So how are you planning on employing the staff? What would you be looking? How would you be looking to apportion liability? How would you be looking to apportion responsibility? And a lot of that can be set out in there. Even where you have a third party doing the employing, you would just bring them into the network agreement and have the arrangements set out in there, rather than having several documents that you need to work with. Schedule 6 was about insolvency, and it was already set out, so not a lot of changes needed to be made there. Schedule 7, again, one that needed to be adapted as the new DES came out. And again, when the new DES comes out, again, it will probably need to be updated, but it was just setting out the arrangements that you would have in place with third parties. And the DES 2021 made it clear that some things did need to be set out in there. For example, how you were going to arrange the community services, how you were going to have relationships with the community pharmacist, how you were going to deal with appointing a social worker, that sort of thing. So network agreement, it is a really important document. It's almost the constitution of your PCN. And so, you know, you can sort of say it's similar to your partnership agreements, because it sets out how you are going to arrange yourself and how you are going to organize yourself, where the rights and the responsibilities lie. So if you haven't taken it out of the drawer, that might be, you know, that's probably a good thing, but do dust it off and just have a look at it and make sure that it still fits how you're operating. So that was sort of a quick tour through the initial stages of a PCN, where you should be your network agreement. I'll focus a little bit more on the corporate structures, which, as I said, is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, and it's where PCNs have, where we understand PCNs are looking the direction that they're looking to go in, and it may or may not be suitable for you. You may not be there at the moment, but it's just giving you an idea of the types of things you should consider if you are looking to go down that route. So just some things to consider if you are looking to go down this road. The nominated payee is a practice in the PCN, and it would continue to need to be so because it's the one that has a qualifying contract, and your corporate entity is unlikely to have a qualifying contract. So just bear that in mind, that one of the practices would still need to be a nominated payee. The company is going to initially be looking to be an employment vehicle. That's certainly what we are hearing from PCNs, that we want employment of PCN staff at an arm's length. We also just don't want the lead practice to have to deal with it. We want all of the practices to have to deal with it. So can the vehicle be an employment vehicle? And yes, it can. The limiting factor has always been the NHS pension scheme, but I will go on to that in a moment. But changes to that have meant that this can really take form now. Jenny will speak more about VAT, but as with everything, that is an issue, but she'll talk about some of the factors to consider there. If you are looking at a separate corporate entity, there are always additional costs. Is it going to be a delivery vehicle? Then do you need to consider CQC? What about insurance? And always be mindful of compliance issues as well if you're creating a separate legal structure. We also get asked about delivery of services, and can a corporate entity do so? And yes, it can, and I'll go on to that in a bit more detail in the next slides as well. So just an idea of some of the structures that you should consider if you are looking to set up a corporate entity. I will focus on the last one in the next slide, because I think that's going to be the most popular one, but I didn't want to discount anything, so just going through the other structures as well. So a company limited by guarantee, it's almost a membership organisation, like a club, and so probably not suitable for your PCNs. It also has limiting factors in that, because it can't hold certain contracts, it's ineligible to access the pension scheme as a classic employing authority. And given that this vehicle is looking to be an employment vehicle, that's probably a fairly limiting factor. And the same is the case for an LLP. An LLP is a limited liability partnership. It's a hybrid between a company and a partnership. So it almost gives you the best of both worlds, familiarity of a partnership with some of the benefits of a company. However, it has the same limitations in terms of the pension scheme. The one I will focus on, as I said, is the company limited by shares. It does provide the most flexibility in terms of how you own the company and how you run the company, but because it can hold a majority of the contracts, majority of primary care contracts, it can also access the pension scheme as a full employing authority. So again, if you are going to hedge your bets, you'd go for the last one. Just to give you an idea what that actually looks like. So that's the company there in the middle. It can hold most of the contracts, access the pension scheme. It can provide services, and it can employ the staff as well. Two-tier structure, the directors run the company and the owners are the shareholders, and they would be the practices. Because it's its own legal entity, it can enter into arrangements with third parties. So as I said, looking ahead, looking to the future, looking at ICSs and looking at entering into arrangements with third parties, you may already have found with your PCNs that it's not quite clear how that structure should be, who should be entering into arrangements or agreements. Is it one practice? Is it the PCN? Is it all of the practices? The PCN itself is not a legal entity. It's just a collection of the practices that are held together contractually, sort of by your network agreement. And so this really gives a wrapper to your PCN, because it is a legal person in its own right. It can enter into arrangements and contracts with third parties. So if we look at the next slide, it's just some of the factors to some of the key features of a company limited by shares. It does benefit from limited liability, which means that any assets or any risks or any liabilities, the assets of the company used to make good that debt. It does not extend further to the shareholders. I guess I would contrast that with your partnerships, which obviously have unlimited liability. So anything happens, then the partners' personal assets are required to make good any debts and losses. That is not the case with a company limited by shares, and we call that ring fencing risk. The risk stays within the legal entity itself. As I said already, it can contract in its own name, which also means it can sue and be sued in its own name as well. Just to give you a balance on the picture there, some of the additional costs that may be involved in setting this up, you will have insurance, indemnity policies, you may need to deal with the CQC if you're looking to provide services, and then you have your annual professional fees as well. Because it's a legal entity, it's governed by the Companies Act and it's registered at Companies House, there are reporting and filing requirements that you have to take into account. That may also be an issue, but as I said, Jenny will discuss that in more detail. We often get asked, can this corporate entity be a community interest company? And the answer is yes, it can. A community interest company has the basic structure of a company limited by shares or by guarantee, but it has these additional features. There is an asset lock, which means that assets cannot be transferred out of the company for less than their value. The main feature is that it must serve a community purpose. Within the health sector, that's quite easy. It's an easy box to tick. You're serving your patient population, you're serving the practices in your area or in your PCN, but it just does need to be made clear as to which community you are serving. There is a dividend and an interest cap on a community interest company, which means that withdrawing dividends, etc., is limited to a certain percentage, and the rest of the monies and profits must be reinvested in the company or within that community that it's serving. How would shareholdings look? So it's very similar to other corporates that you may have seen already. Usually a partner from each practice holds the shares on trust for the other practices in their partnership, and so that would be the structure of ownership, and then obviously you would appoint partners to the board as well. And the flexibility there is that you can determine the size of the board and who is allowed to be appointed there. You would document this in what is known as a declaration of trust, and that sets out the rights and responsibilities of the named partner and also the beneficial owners, i.e. the other partners. It's quite a neat way of dealing with it because changes to the partnership don't necessarily have to result in changes at company level. It's only when the named partner retires that you would need to transfer the share to another partner in the practice. On the next slide, we'll see what has really been the main game changer in why PCNs are looking at setting up corporate entities to go forward to the next stages in their PCN development. In June 2020, the NHS Pension Scheme put out a circular providing determination status to corporate entities that didn't necessarily have a qualifying contract but were looking to employ staff. The main factor was that the staff must directly assist practices in PCNs in the performance of GMS, PMS, APMS, PCN work and under the additional roles. Easy tick box there, that's exactly what you will be doing. The special dispensation is now available until the 31st of March 2023. It's already been extended twice, I guess, with everything that's been going on. And what we understand from the Pensions Agency is that it was anticipated that it would be set in legislation, but that just hasn't happened, which is why they've had to extend it a couple of times already. The application is made to the scheme area team, and we've been told by the Pensions Agency it does take 3 to 12 months, although having done a few of these already, it's taken a couple of months. In any case, the determination is retrospective to the date of employment or the date of transfer of staff. So a real game changer here, and that's why this has been a real hot topic, certainly for us over the last few months. What do you do with your current staff? So we have spoken to our employment team about this, and they have suggested that the best thing would be to transfer them from your current practices. So these are the PCN staff that you may have already employed, transfer them across rather than terminating their employment and then re-employing them at company level, because you could open yourself up to a claim there, but transferring them would be absolutely fine. Just be mindful of the terms and conditions that you offer and try to align them with what has already been offered. Shouldn't be too much of an issue as you're setting up the company from scratch anyway. On the next slide, we'll look at service provision. We often get told, actually, it's not current, that we're happy with the way we are delivering services as a PCN. We've got into a good rhythm, we know what we're doing, but that doesn't mean in the future that's not what we will look to do, certainly as the new DES comes out or new DESs come out, and certainly as other services get provided. So there are two ways really that services can be provided. The DES can be subcontracted by the practices to the company for delivery there. Just be mindful about needing commissioner consent, and also that the company needs to be CQC registered. And remember, as a subcontractor, it does benefit from CNSGP. The other way is if there is a contract available from the commissioner or local authority or something like that, then the company can be used as a vehicle to be the main contract holder. It doesn't need to deliver the services itself. It can then reverse that. It can subcontract to the practices, but it can also deliver the services itself as well. I believe that's all from me. Those are my details at the bottom. If you have any questions, please do ask. I will be around. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Jenny.
Thanks, Neha. I think there is a question for you actually on the Q&A. I don't know if Damien's been able to access it, but a question from Adrian. Neha, what is the difference between a company limited by shares structure and a federation?
So federation is just a term that we've sort of come to give where GP practices have come together in a particular area and formed a federation, a GP federation. Most federations are a company limited by shares, so that structure will be very familiar. It's usually it's the same. So there is no difference there. A federation is just a term that's been given to GP practices, as I said, coming together, but as I said, most of them will be a company limited by shares, so no difference there.
Thanks, Neha. Okay, hello everybody. So I'm Jenny Hurst, and I'm a partner, healthcare partner in BHP Chartered Accountants. So we're a top 40 firm, and we have a large healthcare team within the firm. So we currently act for around 95 GP practices, lots of GP federations, PCNs as well now, and individual GPs as well. So we are members of AISMA, which is the Association of Independent Specialist Medical Accountants. So just like Neha, I'm conscious that there are a lot of PCNs at different stages in their development here today. So I'm trying to cover all bases, albeit briefly. So quick look at PCN accounts. So all PCNs will have now completed their first year of PCN accounts. In my experience, quite a number of PCNs this has dragged on with quite a number, and there's been quite a lot of misunderstanding among some practices on what should be included with those PCN accounts. So we'll have a look at that. We'll also talk about VAT. Neha's already hinted about issues with VAT on staff costs, and a possible solution to that is creating a VAT cost sharing group. So we'll look at that. Pick up also on other matters in connection with creating a limited company structure for your PCN. And then finally, another issue that continues to be misunderstood is the employment status of clinical directors. So PCN accounts, first of all, I've put up on there on the screen, annual accounts need to be prepared. Well, it's not compulsory, but it's certainly something that I would recommend, and not just to create accountancy fees. I think it's necessary for transparency, so that every practice within the PCN can see very clearly all the income that's come in, all the expenditure that's been incurred, and how the surplus is to be shared between the practices. So having those accounts makes sure that every practice will ultimately receive what they're due to, and also share in the liabilities as well. So we'd expect every item within the accounts to be shown separately, all income streams, all expenditure streams as well. Debtors and creditors also need to be accounted for. So just like your own practice accounts, if there's any monies outstanding that are due to the PCN, you would expect to see them brought in, as well as any amounts owing in respect of expenses should be reflected in there as well. So I don't think I've seen a single PCN that haven't shown a profit for the year to 31st of March 2020. So we would expect to see a profit or surplus, whatever you like to call it. And that surplus should then be shared out between the practices, usually on the basis of patient numbers, and each practice share of profit would be reflected in their own individual accounts, and that would result in an income tax liability for the partners of each of the member practices. We've sometimes seen issues where practices have different year ends, so PCN accounts tend to be drawn up to 31st of March in line with the NHS year end, but of course some practices may have other non-March year ends, maybe June or September. And one of the issues is, how do we recognise profit within your accounts if you're, say, a June year end? And really this is a point to discuss with your practice accountant, whether there should be provision for additional profit for that April to June period, whether that needs reflecting within the accounts. It's whether it's material really, and you may consider other factors as well, for instance whether partners are retiring and whether it's important to cover off that extra bit of income period. One area where we've had an awful lot of questions is on development monies. So additional monies coming into practices from CCGs, and these have often been paid out to practices right at the end of the year. And what I often hear is, well, we've not had a chance to spend the money, how can we pay tax on it? And what this comes down to is what the terms of these development monies are. So if you've just been given some money and there are no strings attached to this money, then unfortunately that will need to be shown as income and taxed on the partners. We have had quite a lot of discussions with practices around, can they get any paperwork in place with the CCG? Can they get an agreement with the CCG that this is what certain items are what they've agreed to spend those development monies on? And if they can get a sort of mini contract in writing with the CCG that gives them an agreement that they will spend that money on certain things, that gives us an argument to defer that money to a subsequent period and therefore it defers the tax liability as well. So that's been very helpful in some cases. So second thing to discuss is VAT, specifically on staff costs. And the problem here is that the supply of staff is a taxable supply for VAT purposes. So what that means is if your practice is employing a member of staff, but that member of staff is used by the PCN, and therefore you receive a reimbursement for the use of that staff by the PCN, then there should be VAT added to that cost. And that is a true cost to the PCN. The VAT cannot be recovered by the PCN. Now, this is subject to the VAT registration limit, which is currently £85,000. So what that essentially means is if you recharge staff costs of £85,000 or above in any 12-month period, then you would have to register for VAT and charge VAT on that recharge of staff. Now, this is a real issue for PCNs, but I think within the first year, in most cases, any recharge of staff has been below this £85,000 limit. But I'm conscious that as the number of staff within the PCN increases, then we're going to start running into problems with this VAT registration limit. Now, in thinking about this limit of 85,000, it's important to consider other income within your practice as well. So not just the recharge of staff. And I would expect that all practices would have some income that is potentially VATable. This is largely private work. A classic example is occupational medicals, so HGV medicals and that sort of stuff. If you get up to £85,000 with that sort of income and your staff recharges as well, then again, you're looking at VAT registration. There may also be certain practices within your PCN who are already VAT registered, maybe because they're dispensing practices, and if you're already VAT registered, then any recharge of staff you would be looking to add VAT on. So what's the solution to this problem? Three potential solutions listed on screen there. The first one is one that Neha alluded to previously, was to employ the staff on joint contracts of employment. But the big problem with that, as Neha mentioned, was that there's no access to the NHS pension scheme for those staff. So for most practices, that's straight away off the agenda. The second option is to have an arrangement where a practice is actually delivering a healthcare service to the other practices within the PCN, rather than just supplying them with staff. And in that situation, that would be exempt from VAT. Now, I've had lots of conversations within my with my clients regarding this, and many of them say, oh, that's the solution then. I'm providing a healthcare service, I'm not providing staff. But this is really all about the contractual arrangements that you have with other practices, and you would have to be responsible for delivering that service and also responsible if that service went wrong. It's not a place where most practices want to be, and if you were going down this route, you would need to make sure that you had the proper contractual paperwork in place. And of course, if you're recharging admin staff, then it wouldn't be possible for that to be a healthcare service. So the final thing on there is a cost sharing group. So it is possible, next slide please, Damien. It is possible to form a cost sharing group with your PCN practices. So what you would need to do for this is form a limited company. So we're going down the limited company route again here. As Neha mentioned, this is a separate legal entity, and the company would be owned by the partners of the PCN practices. And the company would employ all the PCN staff. And so long as you tick all the boxes, you would be able to, the company would be able to charge members for their share of the cost of employing those staff with no VAT added on. So that would be classed as a VAT exempt supply. There are some qualifying conditions that you have to tick the boxes for, but that should not be a problem for healthcare, for GP practices. So while we're thinking about limited companies, Neha has already mentioned that it is now possible for the PCN DES to be subcontracted to a limited company. So if you're using a limited company already to employ the staff and get round these issues of VAT and the other HR issues that Neha mentioned, we could also go the full hog and subcontract the clinical services to the limited company as well. So one of the changes that's happened recently from last October is that not only can we subcontract, but now onward subcontracting is also possible. So what that effectively means is not only can you subcontract the PCN work to the limited company, the PCN can now subcontract some of that work back to the individual GPs in the medical practices, and that's a big change and makes using a limited company in this way quite workable. Neha mentioned CQ registration. If we're going down the subcontract route, the nominated payee would remain as one of the practices outside of the limited company unless that limited company was holding a contract. In terms of how the company is owned, that would be, as I've already mentioned, shares would be held by the individual practices. If there was profit within the company, then dividends would be paid out to those shareholders. Normally, they would be split on the basis of patient numbers. You would also potentially have different arrangements for the voting rights, which is often one vote per practice, or it could be set up in any way you choose. Neha already mentioned there are additional costs in running limited companies, so that is certainly something to consider. In terms of tax, when we talk about limited companies, people often think about saving tax, but I would say that a PCN limited company should not be a tax-driven decision, and often you may end up paying slightly more tax going down this route. So the current situation is that limited companies pay tax at 19%. So that's fine for if the profits are retained within the limited company, but if the money is drawn out by way of dividends, then there will be additional tax to pay. So most GP partners are probably 40% taxpayers, and if they draw out money from the limited company by way of dividend, there would be an extra 32.5% tax to pay on those dividends for any 40% taxpayers. So tax savings are unlikely if all the profits are withdrawn. And in reality, it's likely that some of the monies will be left within the company. The company will need some money to operate, just like your own practice. You can't draw all your profit out of the practice. The practice needs some working capital to pay its expenses and other costs. Another issue to consider is partner changes, and this is really something that needs covering off in your partnership agreement. If dividends are only paid out of a company maybe once a year, then what happens when we change partners, and what entitlement do leaving and incoming partners have to those dividends from the limited company. So finally, just a quick run through clinical directors and specifically the employment status of clinical directors. So the issue is here, should they be employed or should they be self-employed? So an employee would be under the control and direction of the PCN, whereas a self-employed person would be more independent in their engagement. And my suggestion, first of all, for any clinical director would be to complete the employment status tool on the HMRC website. So that tool takes you through a series of questions that ask you about your contractual arrangements, and when you've been through those questions, it will spit out an answer as to whether you should be employed or self-employed. Now, if you should be employed, you cannot be employed by your own practice. So that would need to be either another practice or maybe if you were going down the limited company route, then you would be employed by the limited company. One get out of being employment, and in fact the reason that you may prefer not to be employed is because there would be an additional cost to the PCN of employment, because where you employ a person, the PCN also has to pay employers' national insurance at a rate of 13.8%. So that's an additional cost, which of course is not reimbursed. So if you get an answer of employment, it is possible for the clinical director monies to go directly to your practice and be treated as backfill. And the term backfill means that the money goes into the practice, it's pooled among the partners, and then when you take your share, there would be a recognition within your partner share that you're doing additional sessions to cover your clinical director work. So effectively then it would come out to you as self-employed income, but because it's treated as backfill, that's not a problem for employment status. So the other option is if it's self-employed. If you're happy that it's self-employed, and I would recommend that whatever answer you get from the HMRC website, that you take a copy and you keep that as evidence should HMRC ever choose to ask to look at that. So if it is self-employed, then that can be paid to you directly, or again, it can go to your practice and it could come to you as a first share of profit. If it's paid to you directly as self-employed, you may need to consider whether you need to register for VAT. In terms of NHS pension, if it comes via the practice, then it is pensionable income. If it comes directly to you as self-employed, it's not possible to pay pension on it. Although I appreciate that many partners these days don't want to pension any more income than they have to. And that's me done. So happy to take any questions. I think Neha is also still around for questions if you have any.
Jenny, I think there is one there for you, if in case Damien's not able to read it.
There is, sorry. Thank you, Neha. Thanks for picking up. No, I can't see the question, so if you guys are okay to have a look, that'd be appreciated.
Okay.
Sure. So do we have to share out profits, or can it be retained for reinvestment the following year?
Okay, so is this, so presumably we're talking about PCN profit. I'm not sure whether this is limited company PCN or whether it's just the sort of normal PCN that setup that most PCNs have now. So if it's within a limited company, the profit can certainly be retained. And it doesn't have to be paid out, so that's purely a practice decision. So if it's retained, you're looking at your 19% corporation tax and no further tax if you're not paying it out as dividend. It's worth mentioning, actually, while I think about it, that the recent budget announced an increase in corporation tax rates to 25% from April 2023. For any companies earning profits of more than £50,000, and I could see that potentially lots of PCNs would hit that £50,000 level, so we would then be increasing to 25%.
And then there's another question: at which point of self-employed income do you declare VAT status? Is it an amount?
Yes, £85,000. So anything above the VAT registration limit, you would have to declare. Obviously, clinical director money alone would not get you to that £85,000 limit. So you'd then have to consider whether you were doing any other work that might potentially be VATable. Medico-legal work is a classic example that is VATable.
And then, can this webinar video be shared, please? Damien, could you answer that question?
I can, and it will be. If you've registered for it, we have your email address, so we will share the link so you can view it, no problem. And the slides as well.
Oh, I can see Ben actually has just mentioned not currently a limited company. So, so if you're not a limited company, then it's a question of putting together a profit and loss account and for the PCN, and then any profits would have to be reflected in the accounts of the individual practices and therefore taxed as well. So I think it probably goes back to that question of reinvestment, and so I suspect that this is talking about, if we're receiving income, can we carry it forward to a subsequent year rather than recognise it as profit in the current year? So again, this really depends on the contractual arrangements that you have. If you've just received some money and there are no terms attached to that money, then you would have to recognise it as profit. So to defer it to subsequent years and therefore not recognise it as profit and not tax it, you would need to have something in writing, some sort of agreement that whereby you could spend it in a future period. So specific items of agreed expenditure, perhaps.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Are there any more on there? I don't know what's happened to my broadband today. Anyway, not to worry. We do have a little bit more time scheduled for later in the webinar for everybody as well. So if you have any more questions, that's fine. As long as Neha and Jenny don't mind managing that for me. Move on now to Helen, and Helen's going to discuss from Agencia, Helen's going to discuss workforce considerations. Over to you, Helen.
Hi Damien, thank you, that's great. Hopefully people can see and hear me okay. Obviously it's been a great session so far. So I just wanted to kind of touch on a few things in terms of wrapping up, and particularly obviously on the R roles, but just to say that a lot of the focus of our work is around the workforce and helping the workforce to recruit, improve, looking after the workforce, so everything that's sort of in that bag. But obviously the session today, and not to sort of go over other things that people have already said, but just to start off with a bit of a recap in terms of an overview as to what the R's roles are all about. So this is just a little bit of information that sort of pulls that together. So obviously there was an update to the contract, and that's brought in these enhancements with the R's roles, and that's obviously all geared towards the introduction of additional workforce and crucially funding those additional people through the networks. And the extra government funding is to allow for a further 6,000 staff through the scheme at obviously 100% reimbursement. And that brings the total to 26,000 rather than the previously stated 20,000 staff. So that's a significant increase in terms of those additional numbers that are coming in. The funding is for recruitment and employment. It's not for third-party management fees. So just to be clear about that. And again, I'm sure none of this is new to you, but it's interesting to see that roughly on average, each PCN will have approximately 7 FTEs for this year, but then rising up to as many as 20 by 2023-24. So obviously we've got a way to go there, but that just gives you a sense of the timescales and how that workforce will increase. If there's any chance of moving on to the next slide, Damien, that'd be brilliant, thank you. Okay, so in terms of what that might look like in these additional roles, we've got some nice pink blobs on the screen, which are obviously roles that are already in place, and you may well have some of those with you already. The couple that we've got highlighted in blue are obviously the latest new ones that will come into play, and I believe that's as early as next week. So that's just a sense of what's in the mix there in terms of those different roles. Okay, next slide please, Damien, that's great. And I just wanted to give just a couple of examples really to bring some of this to life, because obviously they are new roles and it's not always immediately obvious sort of how you might use them, or perhaps what other people are doing with these roles to get the best out of them. So I just wanted to sort of focus on a couple of examples that give you perhaps some inspiration or ideas or suggestions as to what can be done. So one is around the role of the community paramedic, and they can be doing home visits, they can be assessing and managing presenting patients, apart from obviously some of those real exceptions that wouldn't be appropriate, so perhaps the really complex ones, the acute ones, those with long-term conditions or end-of-life care. So that comes into play there really nicely in terms of dovetailing. The other sort of thing that community paramedics can do is obviously respond to medical emergencies in the practice, and they are part of that multidisciplinary team, so they can be doing things like x-rays, blood test results, a number of things. So that just sort of fleshes out some of the things that if you've got a community paramedic available to you, that's the sort of activity that they can be working on. Next slide please, Damien, that's brilliant, thank you. So another one is the mental health practitioner role, and again just to take a look at that, obviously to be established, but in terms of the pilots that have been run, this one across 12 PCN sites, they can collaborate with other mental health providers, the IAPs, and prevent those that are being isolated from that wider system. So that's a sort of great role if it can be incorporated nicely and integrated with some of the other things that are going on within the system to get the most out of that particular role. So how can some of these roles help with mental health? So there are other mental health roles obviously across the patch. So again, it's looking at how this mental health practitioner might play in and work with those others in the system. So perhaps the social prescribers that might be around, care navigators, and really sort of getting that jigsaw of different roles to work together in the best possible way for you. So that's the mental health practitioner role. Thanks, Damien. And again, now just a couple of examples in terms of case studies. It's always interesting to see how others are doing things. And this is a case study, again, taking the community paramedic with the Wokingham GP Alliance, which is 13 practice PCN. And what they found was that the data showed quite an increase in workload with home visits and comorbidities, particularly amongst the elderly population. And they undertook an audit to see what was going on there. And a number of the findings that came out, I've put a couple just in the slide. So firstly, they realised that actually half of these people could be seen by a community paramedic. So it's by no means everybody, but half is pretty good. And also that if you've got patients that are triaged by a GP, with then those that are more complex being seen by a GP, or then the paramedics are in a position to do what they can, but then obviously working to report back to the GP, but some of the legwork is done by that paramedic. So that's quite interesting just to see. And as a result of that, in terms of outputs, and again, I've just listed a couple there, but by doing that, they found in Wokingham that it was possible for more patients to be managed at home and earlier intervention by teams. And over a 6-month period, again, some quite interesting numbers really, in terms of 96 hospital attendances avoided, 28 999 calls saved, 58 successful pathway referrals, and 75 GP appointments saved. So that's the impact of having one community paramedic in the mix for this particular situation. So yeah, I think that's interesting to see, and shows what can be done. Thanks, Damien. So again, just taking the second case study in terms of a mental health practitioner, this time from a PCN in North Halifax PCN, and they piloted the mental health practitioner in advance of these coming into play next month. And with them, they really wanted to know what would work best, and perhaps what doesn't work, so that they were in a position to really hit the ground running once the funding comes through and we move into next month. And just a question really that comes out of that sort of scenario. We wonder whether there are roles outside of the R roles which would also assist when we're thinking about this team and how best we're making use of the resources that we've got. There may well be others above and beyond the R roles that we've talked about. So, for example, the wound management nurse, but there are others as well, and it's just worth having that question in your mind in terms of the pieces that we can put together to make up that team. Okay, so how can the roles be used? And it is up to each PCN to decide on the sort of best distribution of those roles and what really is required and needed for your situation. And that, of course, will depend also on what's available to you, partly depending on where you might be in the country. Yeah, but ultimately it is over to you to see what you can get and what is going to be most helpful. The thing to remember, which again I'm sure you're aware of, but these roles do have to be new roles. Just to be really clear about that, they are new additional roles, and it's over, of course, to the network then, as we've heard, to decide how this additional workforce is going to be employed and the best mechanism for that. Thanks, Damien, that's brilliant. So, I mean, what should your PCN be doing? And again, just a sort of slight backtrack in terms of where we've come from on this. And if we take a look, obviously, each PCN will have completed their workforce planning with the recruitment plans for this year by the end of August last year. It seems like yesterday, but it's actually quite a while ago. And obviously by the end of October last year, it was necessary for each PCN to have completed at least their indicative intentions right through to 2024 by developing that overarching workforce strategy. Obviously, the plans have now been submitted, with commissioners needing to confirm those plans with clinical directors and not only confirm but agree, sharing those, of course, with NHS England and the regional teams. All of that was done, and by the end of last year, to have a really clear, or as clear as it was possible to do so, indication for what the future plan would be. So that brings us to pretty much the end, and really just to be explicit in terms of developing your PCN workforce. And we've heard quite a bit already, but there are a number of things that we're doing through Primary Care Direct to support your workforce, whether that's the interim capacity type support, whether it's looking at obviously the recruitment and retention of some of these roles, whatever it might be. We're doing a lot of it, and we're available to you if that would help. So I think all that remains to be said is we've got my contact details, which are there, and obviously the slides will be circulated. So very happy to hear from people either now, if we've got a bit of space and time for questions, or certainly afterwards in terms of being in contact beyond today. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. That's great. And I'm flying blind here, so maybe there are some questions. I don't know, Neha or Jenny, does either of you want to take control at this stage?
There aren't any questions on the screen, so nothing raised at the moment.
That's fine, no worries. Well, to let everyone know, this is scheduled till 2 o'clock, and our expert panel are going to be available until 2 o'clock. So if you do have any questions, do fire away now. Perhaps we'll give you sort of 5 or 6 minutes, and then if everybody's actually happy and feels that the majority of the questions have been answered, then we can log off and let you guys go back to your duties. But yeah, if the panel is happy to hang around for a few minutes, that'd be appreciated.
While we're waiting to see if any more questions come through, Damien, one of the questions that we've previously been asked is when setting up a limited company, should practices be thinking about just a normal limited company, limited by shares, or should they be thinking about a community interest company? And Neha did touch on earlier the fact that there is a restriction in the amount that you can take out of a community interest company. So you are limited to 35% of profits can be taken out as dividends. So I think I always come from a financial viewpoint when I'm advising on this, and as there is an increasing amount of funding going into PCNs now, I would always steer away from community interest company, because if there's a lot of funding going into your PCN, then that naturally means that the amount of funding going directly to your practice is going to reduce. and therefore to maintain your profits you will probably need to take profit from your PCN. Community interest companies restrict that to 35% currently, so I would go down the standard route.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, it is a common theme, isn't it? A common question.
Yeah.
Same opinion.
There's a question here. Would someone employed by a federation be entitled to an NHS pension in a non-clinical role? If the federation had access to the pension scheme, then that should include all staff, whether it's clinical or not. It just depends on the type of access they have, I guess. So if we're looking at what I was speaking about in terms of getting that determination status, then that is for all staff. It's not just for clinical, but as long as you satisfied that condition. Federations may also be able to access that determination status as well, especially if they're employing staff for their PCN staff. If they were doing a specific, if they, for example, had an APMS contract or something specific, and staff, both clinical and non-clinical, were working on that contract, then yes, they should also be able to access the pension scheme. So I guess it depends on what access they have and what it's for, but it shouldn't distinguish between clinical and non-clinical roles.
Great, thank you. Hope that helps. Hope that answers the question. Any more for any more? So we've got 13 attendees on, which is great. So if you do have any questions, now's the time. But of course, you have our panelists, or you will receive our panelist contact details for if you need some additional information. We'll say 5 more minutes, if that's okay with everybody. Any more questions popping up, Jenny or Neha?
No. There's some thank yous popping up, but no questions.
Well, thank you. I hope it was informative. We do pack in a lot of information into these webinars in quite a short space of time, so hopefully they're useful. As mentioned, we will be sharing the slides and a recording of the webinar, so you will get opportunity to review. I think we'll give it 1 more minute. I'm sure any questions would have been asked by now. I hope there isn't any attendees busy beavering away typing a question out. But yeah, we'll give it another minute and then we'll thank you, and we'll invite our panelists to log off. Okay, I think we'll conclude there if that's okay with everybody. And we really appreciate your time again, Neha, Helen, Jenny and Kieran. And one more time, we'll be sharing the recording, we'll be sharing the slides. So thank you very much and have a good remainder of your afternoon. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.